Howdy everyone, and welcome back to the channel. My name is Jake and I am a farrier, and today we're going to be trimming a quarter horse mare, and her name is River Dance. And I'm actually going to be shoeing this horse, but I want to emphasize the principles of the trim with you guys and run you through all the steps, describe all the tools along with the process. Now, if you're unfamiliar of the why behind trimming horse feet, I recommend you go and check out my other video, Routine Trim on a Frisian Stallion. I'll put the link at the end. And that will give you a better idea of why we have to keep up on trimming horses' feet. Like I said, this video is going to focus more on the individual steps of this process. Now let's jump on in here. The first thing to note about this horse is she is very overdue from her last trim. So her feet are pretty long and she's in a dire need of a trim and also a reshoeing. Her shoes are very worn out. There I just lifted the clenches in preparation to pull the shoe off, and I'm also now using my hoof pick to clean out that packed in dirt and manure to get a better image of what I'm working with here, and it will also make it easier for me to get the jaws of my pull-offs up underneath that shoe in order to rip the shoe off. And I talked about this in a previous video about how farriers are always fighting with dirt and muck. And I need to remove as much of that as I can so that I have a clear image of how I want to go about trimming this horse's feet. And second, I will wear my tools out so fast, running my nippers or my knife through a foot with pebbles and rocks and dirt and all that. So for that, from the get-go, I pick that foot out, run a wire brush over it, try to get as much off as I can initially. Now just a little side note here, on these hind feet the shoes were so worn out that the nail heads of the nails were just completely worn off. So when I pulled these shoes off, a couple of the nails got left behind in the foot, and I can't leave those in there, otherwise it'll impede my ability to trim the horse's feet properly. So I used my nail cutters to go in and pull each of those out individually. Now here I'm going to start my initial knife work, and another thing to note is I don't typically have to do this much knife work on horses. You'll see throughout this video I go back to use my knife again and again because of how much material I have to remove on this horse. So I typically do not have to use my knife this much on horses. It kind of depends. And for the same reason, I'm also going to be using my nippers a lot more with this horse in order to remove all this material. Now, the reason I'm using my nippers right here in this clip is because there was only so much I could do with my knife, this foot being so hard and dry. I had to get in there and use my nippers to make that initial trim on the frog, which is the little triangular structure there in the middle, and then also to clean up the bars, which are these extensions of the hoof wall that come in on an angle from the heels. And third, I'm going to use my nippers and my knife to remove the retained sole. Now, without getting too deep into the intricacies of the anatomy of the foot, the sole could be described as that wider region between the frog and the hoof wall, that larger space that fills up with sole material over time. And just like other structures of the foot, it's produced by a corium up in the interior of the hoof, and it grows downward. And as it grows downward, it turns into that hardened narcotic structure that you can see here on the outside of the foot. Now, retained sole can be described as an excess buildup of sole material within the hoof capsule. And with this excessive buildup underneath, that material can actually start to rot away and turn into more of this cheesy texture. Now, this material easily harbors bacteria like thrush, which eats away at horses' feet from the inside. And then it's also really good conditions for things like abscesses to happen. All sorts of problems can come from too much retained sole, so I want to make sure I remove the material that doesn't need to be there. Now, another aspect of this is at first glance, this horse in general appears to be pretty flat-footed. But once I get in there and start to remove material, I see just the opposite. I actually see a fair amount of natural concavity to this foot, or a lot more natural depth as I remove that retained sole. And that's important to know because that affects my decision of how much of the hoof wall I'm going to nip off. And a similar principle goes for trimming the frog. Now, the frog is actually a structure that naturally sheds itself over time. And it's also designed to bear some of the weight of the horse. So over trimming the frog is actually quite unnecessary. However, if the frog gets overgrown, it can block my view a little bit of how much depth I actually have in that foot, as well as it can also disguise the actual length of my heels, which affects how much I'm going to be nipping off with my nippers. So to break down this first portion of the trim, I am using my knife and my nippers to remove excess materials in order to find the depth of my foot, the length of my heels, and be able to make a decision of how much of the hoof wall I need to nip off. Now here I'm going to use my nippers to nip off the excess growth of the hoof wall. Now this is extremely important because this is the main weight-bearing structure of the foot that I'm dealing with. How much, where, and the angle at which I make this cut affects so many different things on the horse, from how he moves to how he stands to the angle of the coffin bone, which is the lowest bone in the horse's leg. It's actually inside the hoof capsule. And also how the weight is borne on the bones in the lower leg as well as the joints. So there's a lot riding in how I make this cut. That brings me to the point of how you can always take more material off, but you cannot put material back. You can always go back again and remove a little more. But once you've made that cut, you've made that cut, and there's no putting it back on. Now, that all aside, my main end goal with this portion of the trim is to have a strong weight-bearing surface that is flat and even all the way around from heel to heel. And that starts here with how I run my nippers. So now that I've made that cut and made this foot shorter, I've actually decreased the depth of the hoof overall. And I've actually brought the sole plane and those other interior structures of the foot down closer to the ground. And because I'm going to be shoeing this horse, I need to think about how the horse is going to bear weight wherever that foot has contact with the shoe. So prior to nailing that shoe on, I want to make sure that it's going to have contact and bear weight through structures like the hoof wall and the white line, and not through regions, for example, the sole, which is not designed to bear near as much weight. And that leads into what I'm doing in these clips here, which is relieving sole pressure. And with some of these feet here, I am still just removing that rotten narcotic material, but I'm also doing this with relieving sole pressure in mind, where I'm removing that extra sole material so that it doesn't have contact with the shoe. Therefore, the horse will not be bearing weight on it, and it won't be under too much pressure, which can easily make a horse sore. All right, now let's talk about rasping. So I carry two kinds of rasp. I carry pretty standard 14-inch working rasp, which is what I'm using here. And then at the end to finish the foot, I use a finishing rasp. Now this goes back to what I just said about how and where the horse bears its weight on the foot. What I am looking for is to create a plain, flat, balanced, and even surface all the way around on this hoof wall. So for example, I'm making sure that my heels are on level with my toe, or that I don't have one quarter higher than the other. Those are all just different parts of the hoof wall. And occasionally you see me here stopping and looking down the foot from the back. And I'm looking for that flatness and checking to see where I might need to go back and take a little bit more off. So now we're on to the final step of the trim, and that is gathering and top dressing. And here I'm going to be removing what is known as flare. Now the hoof wall is made up of all these tiny little structures that you can't see with the naked eye, and they're known as horn tubules. And they all grow right next and in line to each other from where that hairline meets the hoof down to the ground. Now most of those horn tubules will grow down in line all the way to the ground and become that weight-bearing surface of the hoof wall that I was talking about. And some of it, as it grows to the bottom, it will actually become distorted and start to grow outward. And this is what we call flare. Now, excess flare can greatly affect the movement of the horse, so I got to remove it. And I can only do so much of this with my rasp because I don't want to compromise the weight-bearing surface of the foot. But where there is a little bit of material run forward and distorted at the bottom of the foot, I do need to gather that back up, and I can use my rasp to soften those edges and mold the foot a little bit to be more like it was before it was flared out. Now second, I'm going to top dress, and that's where I'm going to use my rasp to take long strokes from top to bottom and remove that little bit of a bubble, that little bit of distorted material at the bottom of the foot. Now same thing goes for this. I want to make sure that I don't take off too much material. I want to take off just the right amount because I don't want to take the angle of the hoof to be lower than the natural angle at which it is currently growing. And this is also my opportunity to make things look nice. Like I said, I'll use a finishing rasp at the end to get all my lines out, clean everything up, and make it look as good as I can. A lot of your top dress work is more of an aesthetic thing. Not that horses care what their feet look like, but lots of horse owners do, so that's that. Anyways, guys, those are all the steps of the trim. Here's River with her feet all cleaned up, shoes on, ready to go. She is all set. Hope that you enjoyed this video and that you learned something. If you want to learn more about the trim, here's the link for that video, and it gives a great explanation of the why behind trimming horses, so I recommend checking that out. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button and subscribe as well. We got a lot more great content coming your guys' way. Anyways, can't wait to see you all in the next video, and until then, adios.